today, the First Lady, and she's expressed a desire to sing our song. So, here's how we do it. I hope Gary hasn't forgotten the tune. I hope you haven't forgotten the words. I hope I haven't forgotten the words. And I hope you haven't forgotten the words. One, two, three. Take me out to the ball. Me out to the buy me some.
The Monday Morning Quarterback on the 3rd of September 2018. Our first program in the month of September as we move past the magic mark of the beginning of the fall campaign on Labor Day. This is in fact Labor Day. Happy Labor Day to the workers out there in the U.S. The rest of the world had their Labor Day on May the 1st, May Day. But nonetheless, we move on. A couple of programming notes here. Our technical presentation, the open source report, is ready on various outlets, including iHeart Media, Spreaker, YouTube, etc. And also, we are in the process of finishing up the Reefer tribute. We have most of it there. We edited 9 hours down to over an hour, and we'll put an introductory in and get it up today. Also, there's special Labor Day coverage. Now, it kind of overlaps. The Monday Morning Quarterback will look also at workers. And in our canned presentation, we go to Meet the Press, and also we have the eulogy by former President Barack Obama for the late Senator John McCain, who was buried at the Naval Academy, in Annapolis, Maryland. And the funeral was at the National Cathedral. He had several. He had a funeral in Phoenix and also at the National Cathedral where President Obama was there, and G.W. Bush were some of the speakers there, along with his daughter, I believe, also gave a eulogy there for Senator McCain. So what we'll do today is we'll hear from Kareem-Abdul-Jabbar. He'll be talking about the African-American athlete, and he also will refer back to 1968, a long time ago. There was a Democratic convention in Chicago. And that was a very contentious year. Mayor Daley, the late Mayor Daley, put the Chicago police on peaceful demonstrators and made a mockery of the democratic process. And eventually the nominee was to be Hubert Horatio Humphrey, the senator from Minnesota, who was had been a senator, I should say, who was the vice president under Lyndon Johnson. And you had the Vietnam War, was very unpopular. Also, it was a time of very similar to today that the reactionary forces had banded together. Many of them had supported George Wallace. And Nixon got the Southern, that's Tricky Dick, got the Southern strategy going there to capture those 7 states. And he went on to defeat Senator Vice President Ben Humphrey was the end game. But before they could have that, they had the national anthem that was sung at the Democratic Convention, and the singer was Aretha Franklin, and she was criticized for how she sung the quote-unquote national anthem at the time. And there was general criticism of how so-called soul singers were singing the national anthem. It was a big bone of contention. We'll talk about it, and we'll also look at the latest business daily poll that shows DJ Trump further in the hole, and the Washington Post had him, I believe, at a 40% approval rating. Very interesting trend. We'll be watching it and see where it goes and in terms of things shaping up. We'll also look at some progressive candidates. We have primaries coming up this week in the Northeast. In the Commonwealth, we have several congressional primaries. And in New York, Cynthia Nixon takes on Como. We'll have that debate, hopefully, between Cynthia Nixon and Como. And we will probably put two debates together. There was a debate between the gubernatorial candidates in the upper Midwest state of Minnesota. That is Walz and Johnson. And so we'll look at perhaps those two. Their contest is in November, but we'll round that out. I'm not sure how we'll do that. Maybe anyway, we'll figure it out nonetheless. And today we bring in college football. We have not made an editorial decision on what we'll do with the NFL. Their season starts shortly, but for now, with the exception of certain features about the NFL around the owners and around Colin Kaepernick, we will not have them, as one would say, in our good grace. We'll start out with E.J. Dionne. He's writing from Boston on the 2nd of September, 2 Labor Days into DJ Trump's presidency. What's happened to the working class? After the election of 2016, we heard again and again about how Trump had frilled those who labored and are heavily burdened, particularly those amongst them who are Europeans. He used the term white. We use Europeans more fitting. There was a nonstop commentary about how out-of-touch citizens in the big and prosperous metro areas have become. Metropolitan areas, anyway. At the time, you might have imagined that Trump had been the Marxist candidate running against a creature of Wall Street named Hillary the Monster Clinton. Was Solidarity Forever about to become the nation's second anthem? We don't hear much about the working class anymore. We get more reporting on the Trump base, overlapping but ultimately quite a different group, and how its members will stick with him no matter, and how, never mind that the latest Washington Post poll is 60% of the American people disapprove of him. And you notice how it's written there. Instead of saying 40% approve, 60% disapprove. His supporters have assumed an almost a magical role in our politics. One reason class is rescinding in our public debate. The Trump years have, so far at least, done a little for wage earners. Indeed, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics, real hourly wage overall dropped between January of 2017 and, July of 2017 and July of 2018. They dropped for mid-wage workers, and this is not at all the winning Trump promised. Nor have the politics of the Trump administration been focused on the welfare of workers. On the contrary, one of the scrimpiest parts of Trump's politics is that he talks like a labor leader but acts like a corporate lobbyist. His tax cut showered benefits upon the wealthiest segment of society and produced deficits so massive that the Republicans are now prompting cuts in social benefits that go into a significant part to, yes, the working class. A partial exception may be Trump's renegotiation of NAFTA, that's the North American so-called free trade with Mexico. We are aware of all of the final details, including the enforcement mechanism and Trump freezing Canada out of the initial round of discussions and the spiteful attitude towards our closest ally, undermining any potential good in the deal. But the tentative provision regarding wedges and dispute resolution that had previously tilted towards the interests of investors do not appear to be a real improvement from the prospect of workers. Do, I say, appear to be, but perhaps only a Republican president could get away with doing this. We see that the GOP leaders made of propositions they would denounce as socialist if a Democrat were in the White House. There's always a false element in Trump's common man appeal. The gender reference in that sentence is not an accident. Limiting the working class with adjectives like white in part is a large part of the problem. The core Trump ideology, such as it is, has never been about class. His position has always been for race, culture, and immigration. Many election studies suggest that Trump's voters were more energized by these issues than economics. Watch the typical Trump stump speech, and you will find that fear-mongering smooths any uplift, and that falsehoods about immigration outnumber the truths about changes to middle-class standard of living. Any politician who is serious about the working class needs to think about it as a whole, which means remembering how many wage earners are African Americans and Latino. They have been hit as hard by de-industrialization as European workers, and many harder. Yet attention has been paid to European workers whose living standards have stagnated or worse, but attention must also be paid to the country's racial wage divide, as David Cooper pointed out in the summer analysis as for the Economic Policy Institute. But 8.6% of European workers were paid poverty wages in 2017. The figure was 19.2 for Latinos and 14.3 for African Americans, if they can find a job. Broadly shared economic growth is not a cure for all of our social tensions, but it would surely ease them, and it needs to reach across the lines of both class and race. The fact that Trumpism is not solving the problem is it claimed would not mean that we should forget the lessons we were supposed to learn from this election. Wide disparities in regional growth, not only between states, but also within them. Aggregate the already profound divisions that ail us, racially uneven economic fortunes, danger individuals and families, damage individuals and families, and they can also destroy whole communities. No doubt Flint, Michigan comes to mind, engulfing them in a vicious cycle as local institutions, from churches to unions to civic groups, are hollowed out. Labor Day celebrates the power of collective action in defense of the dignity of work, alias Trump, that has made such effect more urgent and not less. Now, it's interesting here when you look at these various studies. Now, there are districts out there that voted for Barack Obama 2 times and then voted for DJ Trump. Now, were those districts motivated by racial animus, or were they motivated by better economic times? Very interesting to say that. But if you also look at some of the polls that would suppose that Bernie Sanders had been the candidate showed that Bernie Sanders would have easily won the presidency, and a majority of the Trump voters, not all, but a majority of them. Now, you have to understand who these Trump voters are. We've looked at their incomes, for instance. Majority of Trump voters earned $50,000 or more, between $50,000 and $75,000, and also that 80% of the 80 to 90% of the Republican Party supports the programs of DJ Trump. Now, these are things that we have to put out here as solid facts. EJ has done a good job in bringing the working class in, but we also at the same time need to understand the whole dynamics as well as we can of how people voted. And I was thinking about Minnesota 1. That's the gubernatorial candidate. Waltz is running from it. That district voted for Barack Obama 2 times and for DJ Trump. So, in other words, that is an interesting situation. And there are many more. Now, one state, obviously, that remained the same was West Virginia, that truly had a racial amicus going there in the state of West Virginia. And a number of other states. If you go to Alabama, Mississippi, the Republican Party there is a European party. The African American parties in those states, African Americans in those states belong to the tent called the Democratic Party, which is in fact populated by followers of O.J. Simpson. And at the same time, we have races going on in Florida. The label of the monkey appeared in Florida. Brutal racism, the idea of energizing race into the campaign. Tricky Dick did the same thing, and we go back to Bush 1, George H.W. Bush, and the ads against our own Professor Michael Dukakis, and the Willie Horton ad featuring William Horton in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts furlough program. But the race has been used to energize the base, and energizing the base in Florida. The only question there is 2 things. One, will the government integrity investigation into the government in Tallahassee affect Andrew Gillum? And 2, how many moderate Republicans in Florida and independents will not buy into DeSantis' line and DJ Trump's line? We noticed in Texas, billboards are appearing of tweets by DJ Trump on Ted Line Cruz. Now DJ Trump embraces Ted Line Cruz. But that's the dichotomy there, and how it's rolled out in Texas. Beto O'Rourke, running out of El Paso, Texas, is running not a word-calling campaign, but a campaign based upon issues. We've talked about that in the American political science for a very long time. Can you run an issue-oriented campaign as opposed to the Karl Rove type campaign, Tricky Dick Morris, etc., where you are running on nothing but wall-to-wall attack ads? Now, in the Trump campaign, you had wall-to-wall attack tweets and various other machinations coming in there, in using a stream of consciousness campaign, which is a little bit different. That allows one to not only use quote-unquote dirty campaign ads, attack ads, or comparative ads, what you want to call it, but at the same time it allows to use both positive and negative images, such as the Access Hollywood tape. It was a negative situation for DJ Trump, but it was on TV, so DJ Trump turned it into a positive. Because in that type of campaign, negative, positive news, in other words, plus minus does equal 1. An interesting equation there within itself. So it does not go into a negative number, period. So that is one of the features of that type of campaign. But the problem is it's not a long-term stratagem. And we'll go to the Business and Investors Daily and look at it and see where things are. Let's firstly go to Kareem-Abdul-Jabbar. He is writing here, what sports has taught me about race in America. Very appropriate because race coming in. A picture of Kareem, Jim Brown, now a Trump supporter, Muhammad Ali, and Bill Russell, and many, many more that are in the picture. As the Guardian series on race and sports starts today, we mark 2 years since Colin Kaepernick first kneeled during the national anthem. I'm reminded that whenever an NBA player comes close to shattering one of my dusty old records, eager journalists contact me to ask how I feel, and here's how I feel. At times I set the records, and most points are scored, most block shots, and most MVP. Bah ha 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 ha. I celebrate them because they confirm that my hard work and discipline since childhood were effective in me achieving my goals and becoming the best possible athlete. But that wasn't my only goal. Even greater significance in those records have led me to them, and me to even more now in providing a platform to keep the discussion on social inequities, whether racial, gender-related, or economic alone, and vibrant, so that we may come together as a nation and fix them. Historically, that has been the greatness of the American spirit. We don't flinch at identifying our faults and using our moral fortitude and ingenuity to become a better nation. In honoring that spirit, I pay tribute to the most important mentors, UCLA coach John Wooden and Muhammad Ali. It is Ali's voice I often hear in my head when you saw me in the ring fighting. It wasn't just so I could beat my opponent. My fights had a purpose. I had to be successful in order to get people to listen to the things I had to say. All sports records would eventually be broken, but the day after they are, the world wouldn't have changed. But every day you speak up about injustice, the next day the world might be a little better for someone. Sports is the most popular form of entertainment, with Americans spending about $56 billion on sporting events last year, compared with about $11 billion on movies. 72%, 18 to 29-year-olds consider themselves sports fans, as do a majority of those older. The level of prosperity that's made sports more than just entertainment, level of popularity, and also I'd say prosperity, It's also a part of our national identity, a source of inspiration for personal achievement, and it means to teach our children valuable lessons about teamwork and social ethics. For African American, sports have all of these values, but also has some extra implications. For people of color, professional sports has been a minor of American attitudes towards race, as long as black players were restricted from taking the field. Then the rest of black America would never truly be considered equal, meaning they would be not equally educated or on employment opportunities. After all, they were permitted to play sports. Sports has been a public face of America. Not only we sentimentally profess to believe when waving the flag on the 4th of July, and also on Labor Day, I'll add, but our actual daily behavior. This is why what Whatever happens in sports regarding race plays out in the on the national stage. Right now, sports may be the best hope for change regarding racial disparity, because it has the best chance of informing white American, and we prefer European Americans, that disparity and motivating them to act. The problem is this is not the message that those who profit from a disparity want the public to hear. They attempt to silence the voices of dissent in sport today, as they have throughout my lifetime and before. And the attempt is always disguised as an appeal to patriotism. They use the flag the way a magician uses a cape to misdirect the audience, and in political consulting, we always talk about a misdirect. Proof, no racism here, folks. To white America, the history of U.S. sport is raising a graph of remarkable achievement of physical and mental strength. To black America, it is that, but it is also a consistent timetable of attempts to silence the voice of African Americans. In 1964, Ali refused to submit to the draft during the Vietnam War on the grounds that my conscience would let me go shoot my brothers. Or some of the darker people caused him to be sentenced to 5 years in prison, a $100,000 fine, and banned for boxing for years. He gave up millions of dollars, faced prison to speak the truth. In 1971, the conviction was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, 8-0 unanimous decision. Thurgood Marshall abstended. In 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos stood on the podium in Mexico City and raised their gloved fists. Carlos later said it was not a black power salute, but a human rights stand. Smith said, "We are concerned about the lack of black assistant coaches, about how Muhammad Ali got stripped of his title, about the lack of good housing for our kids, and attention to top colleges." The same year, Aretha Franklin sung the national anthem at the Democratic Convention. Her performance was widely criticized in the press as disgraceful, objectionable, nerve-shattering. Editorials routinely decried soul music and referred to her as, in an insulting way, as a soul sister. One wrote, "Angry reader, soul has its place, where I'm not sure, but it's certainly not in the performance of our country's anthem." Even her magnificent voice was too black for the national anthem and had to be silenced. In 2016, called Copenhagen Passionate Protest Against Injustice, the single act of kneeling during the national anthem ignited a firestorm of support and condemnation. Other players and from other sports joined his nonviolent protest. Copenhagen himself was punished by his NFL career appears to be over after he was blacklisted by the teams. I'm going to have to finish this up. This is very long. But I'm more energized and hopeful when I see that the same athletes speak out against injustice, because I know in doing that they are risking the careers that they spend their whole life working towards. Their willingness to risk everything in order to give voice to the powerless, despite all these efforts to silence them, makes me proud as an athlete, as an American. As Mark Twain once said, true patriotism is the only rational patriotism. It's loyalty to the nation all the time, loyalty to the government when it deserves it. Athletes who speak out are proclaiming their loyalty to the Constitution that demands equality and inclusiveness, not the government official who tries to undermine those ideas by silencing their critics. Now, this is in the Daily Beast when Aretha Franklin sung the Star-Spangled Banner, it drew a torrent of racial abuse. And we have it here, and let me just get it up. This is from the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, Illinois. And it may take a minute to get it. We'll try. The Star-Spangled Banner began the festivities was mostly observed only by those on radio as recently as 2014. A scholar who wrote a book about U.S. national anthem believed there was no video exist. The video, in fact, does exist, and we'll try to get it here. And then we'll go to the poll by the business. Well, we'll have to, as they say, save this for a future broadcast. Oh. Anyway, technical difficulties here leave us out of that particular loop. We'll go now to the business dailies situation here, and I understand this is an audio problem we had. We can't correct it at this stage of the game, but we'll get to it later. This was on a Saturday. The approval rating was at 36, and we will get that up now. And okay, Trump's approval rating nosedive. Demo's blue wave might be building here. This is just 36% say they approve of DJ Trump. Is doing a 5-point drop from last month, according to the Independent Business Daily tip poll. But 56% of people disapprove of his performance, up from 53%. The drop in approval rating, Trump's approval rating, comes after a spat of bad news, including conviction of his former chair and various other people. The broader Independent Business tip Presidential Leadership Index plunged 11.6% to a 40.4. That is one of the biggest monthly drops since the Independent Business Daily started tracking of this index in 2000. Trump's approval rating losing GOP support. Trump lost support significant ground on job approval with Republicans this month, fell from 83 to 76%. Amongst independents, his approval rating dropped 4 points to 33%. He saw a big drop in support from men. He went from 49 to 40%. His backing amongst women barely changed. It's currently 32%. Regionally, the biggest loss were in the Northeast, where you'd expect it to be. His approval rating dropped 12%. In the West, it dropped only 2%. They didn't have much to drop there. His support amongst rural dwellers plunged 15 points. Going from 60 to 45%, it fell 7 points amongst suburban voters to 45. The Real Clear average polls have Trump's approval rating at 42.8, which is down a point from a week before. There's a blue wave building. Trump's staggering approval rating seems to be improving a Democrats' chance of controlling the House after the midterm elections last month. The IBD tip poll showed registered voters equally split, 45 to 45, which whether Congress should be controlled by the Republican Democrats. The current poll, the Democrats have an 11-point advantage. 50% say they prefer Congress controlled by Democrats, 39% by Republicans. Department of Commerce revised its GOP figure for the for Q2 upward to 4.2. Hit an all-time last month high. The numbers came out on the 4th. Scored a victory on the Mexican trade with Mexico on the tariffs approval rating. High marks on the economy. While the public doesn't approve of Trump's overall performance, 45% give him top marks on handling of the economy. Now, despite the economy firing on all cylinders, Trump still must contend with the sensationalism surrounding Special Counsel Mueller. The Russian investigation that's from the president of Technometric Marketing Intelligence, Meru, did this. In addition, an escalating feud between he and Bourgard Sessions. Other findings: 60% say any talk of impeaching DJ Trump is premature. A plurality believed Trump's tax cuts had a positive effect on the economy. 37% say yes, compared with 26% that say no. 29% see higher take-home pay as a result of the tax cuts. The share of job-sensitive households, those with someone looking for work or for worrying about being laid off, saw a 3-point drop to 24%. 44% said they are satisfied with the direction of the country. And this poll was conducted August 23rd through the 30th. Includes a response of 902 adults nationwide who were asked questions by live interviewers on phones. Margin of error being 3.3%. Generic ballot questions included in 330 respondents there. And we don't have the crosstabs, at least don't have them right now here. We'll get those crosstabs for you, and we'll find out what people were in the poll on a later broadcast. Nonetheless, let's get to sports now. Look at the time here. Yeah, we're rolling along because we have a canned presentation. Nonetheless, tonight, Virginia Tech and Florida State. Florida State is, it looks like number 10, I guess. Anyway, and number 26 Virginia. It doesn't really matter this time of the year. Nonetheless, the finals. This was some Thursday night. UFC 56 to 17, the University of Connecticut. And on a Friday, more Western Kentucky and number 4 Wisconsin 34-3. Utah State and Michigan State, a closer game, 38-31. San Diego State and Stanford. Stanford looks like it's ranked number 10. 31-10 was the score there. Stanford, Louisville, Alabama. That was on Saturday. Alabama, number 1, 51-44. Furman and Clemson 48-7. Austin, Peavy and Georgia, they were shut out. Doesn't matter. 45-zip. Oregon State and Ohio State at 77-31. Washington and Auburn 21-16 for them. Florida Atlantic and Oklahoma, another one of these basketball scores, 63-14. And in a final overtime, Penn State 45-38 for Appalachian State, I believe it is. Michigan and Notre Dame. Notre Dame beat Michigan 24-17. And UNLV was beaten by OJ's old team, USC 43-21. Southern and TCU 55-7. West Virginia and Tennessee, West Virginia 40-14. Stephen Austin and Mississippi State 63-32. 6. Boise State and Troy. I think it's Troy State also. 56-20, Boise State. Texas and Maryland. Maryland beat Texas 34-29. Bowling Green and Oregon. The Ducks 58-24. University of Miami, the Hurricanes, and LSU 33-17 was that score. On to baseball on Sunday night. The Tigers were in New York. Tigers 11-7. That's kind of surprising. The Blue Jays and Marlins in Florida. Blue Jays 6-1. They're back to their winning ways. The Brewers and Nationals in D.C. The Nationals are kind of in a tailspin at this point in time. The Brewers are 10-4. The Cubbies and Phillies in Philadelphia. Cubbies win this in 8-1. The Lions scored. The Cubbies had 9 hits. The Phillies had 10 hits. Both had no errors. The Red Sox and White Sox in on the south side of Chicago. The White Sox shut out the Red Sox 8-0. The Orioles and the Royals in Kansas City. Royals 9-1 there. And in 10, the Reds and Cardinals in St. Louis. The Reds pulled this one out 6-4. The Twins and Rangers in Texas. Rangers 18-4. The Twins will be going to see Houston next, I believe. The Mariners and Athletics in Oakland. Athletics 8-2. They're chasing the Astros of Houston. In the American League West, the Mets and Giants in San Francisco. Mets 4-1, 2 teams that are going nowhere. The D-backs and Dodgers in Los Angeles. The Dodgers pull this one out 3-2. Kenley Jensen got the save. Bumgarner. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry, not Boxberger. I don't know who Boxberger is. Anyway, the Rockies and Padres down in San Diego. Rockies are 7-3. The Pirates and Atlanta 5-1 in that contest. And the Angels and Astros, a game that we tuned into. The Astros pulled that one out 4-2. It was a well-pitched game. Mr. Cole was a winner. And let's see who finally got the loss there. I'm not sure. Wait a minute. Anyway, that is Major League Baseball. Let's see how quickly I can get the standings. Sometimes we have a little bit of a problem with the standings here. We try to give these on Monday night, but we don't always succeed. Anyway, we got them now. The American League, the Red Sox are still on top. The Yankees are 7.5 games back. Tampa Bay is 20 back. Forget about them. In the American League Central, Cleveland is on top, and Minnesota Twins at 14 back. And Kansas City at 13. Forget it. In the West, Houston is on top. Then the Athletics, they are 2.5 games back. 8 games back is Seattle. In the National League East, Atlanta is on top. Then Philadelphia, and then they're 4 back in the Phillies, and the Nationals are 8 back. Well, you never know. The Cubbies on top in the Central. The Brewers are next, but they are 5 games back. The Cardinals are 5.5 games back. So I guess you got a race between the Brewers and Cardinals. In the National League West, the LA Dodgers are on top, and a half game back is Colorado. Rockies, and 1 game. This thing is still very, very tight. Anyone can win this. Is the Arizona Diamondbacks, and San Francisco is 7.5 games back. They are basically out of this. Have a good Labor Day holiday, everyone, and a good next week. I don't know why we're using the word good. period. And we will have that special on Labor Day, and we'll finish a reefer off. Also, we have the open source report as a technical report on many of these channels, and also Numbers Man. This Week in Economics we have on these channels: iHeart, Stitcher, Spreaker, YouTube, and you name it.
Quickly, Republicans shot down that neo-Nazi call. And does that reassure you that they don't want to make race an issue in this campaign?
Well, I mean, I think what's important is that Mr. DeSantis and obviously the president really try to go high on this thing. We cannot afford to weaponize race and to go to the bottom of the barrel here. And honestly, people are going to take their cues from what their leadership says. And in this case, Ron DeSantis is the leader. And therefore, he's got to be very, very careful about how he addresses these kinds of issues. I'm pleased to see them decry those robocalls. But it's also important that Ron DeSantis take control and ownership of his own rhetoric and words. Because we already know that given the highly sensitive nature we now find ourselves, that people take their cues and sometimes they act out in ways that go far beyond what is appropriate in today's environment.
You do not think Congressman DeSantis is a racist, do you?
I have not called him a racist.
I know you haven't.
What I simply said was that his rhetoric, in my opinion, has to be toned down. That what I will call him is someone who has worked to undermine the healthcare system, someone who has decided to join with Donald Trump in giving more and more money away to the largest and wealthiest corporations and less to regular, everyday working people. I'm happy to debate him on the merits of public policy. I am not going to get into the gutter and name call. That's not what Florida voters are interested in, and certainly that's not why I ran for governor. I'm here to talk about the issues that confront the people of our great state.
National correspondent for the New York Times Magazine and author of the new book, Big Game, The NFL in Dangerous Times. Welcome all. Let me just get right to it. I think Susan Glasser in The New Yorker put it in a quite interesting way about the John McCain Memorial Service with the headline, John McCain's funeral was the biggest resistance meeting yet. She writes, McCain's grand funeral. The Obama advisor David Axelrod called it an exercise in civic communion, underscored a fact that is often lost about Washington these days. The city is much more bipartisan in some respects than it has ever been, more united than it may currently seem in its hatred of Donald Trump. Amy Walter.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting you asked the question about this was a sort of a memorial service for an era of politics that is no longer with us. But I'd also argue that that era left us a long time ago, and that this world that we're in, the tribalism, the polarization, the incentive structure has pulled us to this place before Donald Trump ever came. And that he is exacerbating it, there's no doubt. But the service itself, I think, the call to our better angels, our better selves, stands out because of the contrast with the president. But I just think that whoever was president right now, these issues would still be the driving force. And we're not going to get past it because of the fact that there is no incentive for folks to try to bridge this divide.
Amy Klobuchar admitted that in that question. You know, Mark Leibovich, I'm old enough to remember when George W. Bush was the most divisive president of our lifetimes and when Barack Obama was the most divisive president of our lifetimes. And yet these two were making a call to arms for a more civil time of politics.
Right. Bill Clinton, too. Don't leave him
I
out.
forgot.
I mean, you go back. No, look, I mean, I have to say, Ted Kennedy, his funeral, 8 years ago, whenever it was, there was the same sort of call to unity, bygone era. He worked across the aisle and so forth. So, I mean, I guess not cliche alert there because I think it's real, but it's true. This was deeply personal. There's no question it was deeply personal. There was no president who was, not invited, pointedly not invited to an event like this. And, yes, this environment was created, and Donald Trump might be perpetuating it in some ways. But I also think that this is very Trump-specific. This is, I mean, I think larger words and concepts like unity are important, but this was very Trump-specific.
Let's be, it was Trump, the president's comportment that has bothered so many people, Matthew. Really, you can't, I guess we should be glad he didn't tweet a negative.
right?
But that's a low ball.
Certainly the McCain-Trump feud began with comments by Trump, but I think it also became something larger. And there was an ideological component to a lot of the eulogies here, talking about John McCain's ideas. When I looked at that ceremony, I saw John McCain designing the rebuttal to President Trump's inaugural address from a year and a half ago. We went from American carnage to the American idea or promise. We went from very negative speech to a very positive speech. Everything is fine. America doesn't need to be made great again. The truth is that John McCain's America, the America that was represented at the National Cathedral yesterday, doesn't need to be made great again because it's doing fine. So the contrast is with Trump and who Trump represents. For them, America is not doing fine. They like the more negative message.
I'm glad you brought this up, Kimberly. There was part of me that felt like, is this scene in the National Cathedral going to be seen as like the last gathering of the bourgeois as the revolutionaries come with their pitchforks? Or is it this call to arms where, whoa, we're going to stabilize America again?
I think it depends on who you ask. I think for some people it'll be both to that extent. But I think it's also important to remember, as much as we're talking about bipartisanism, a bygone era, remember that the fights between John McCain and Barack Obama were tough ones. They were strong. They were on opposite sides of on issues. And as soon as any policy came out of the White House, if reporters remember that our inbox were immediately filled with John McCain's office really excoriating everything that Barack Obama did. But yesterday, when he stood up there to speak, he was listed in the program as friend. Friend first, President of the United States later. They had respect for one another. There was partisanism, there were bitter battles, tough battles, but there was not the pettiness that we see today. I think that's what people were addressing yesterday.
I thought there was one moment that stuck out for me. I mean, Barack Obama talked about, yes, they had those battles. We talked privately in the White House from time to time. No one advertised that.
That was first I'd heard that.
First I'd heard that.
But I believe it.
But what was interesting about that is he ended that anecdote with a refrain: "We never doubted that we were on the same team." He said it twice. And when I hear team, I mean, I think that actually gets to loyalty to America, if you ask me. I mean, when I hear team, I think patriotism. I think we both never doubted that we're trying to move this country forward. And to me, that was a very, very poignant.
Now we have a country that we don't believe we're on the same team.
No.
There are two Americas that don't believe that we are on the same team, and you have to choose a side. You're on this team or you're on that team.
And if you're not on the right side of the team, you're unpatriotic. You're un-American.
We're fighting over who gets to define patriotism, Matthew. I mean, by the way, that gets to your book later on, but we're having this massive fight over patriotism.
One of the eulogies that struck me was actually Henry Kissinger's. And what he was talking about was how McCain lived by the warrior's code. McCain brought in ideas that aren't normally part of the discussion in Washington. Things like courage, nobility, honor, and character. And these are all values that were very important to John McCain's approach to politics, and it's one reason why he was able to create relationships across the aisle. These are values that I think are been diminished, and I think they come from John McCain's experience in the U.S. military.
This week, besides being about John McCain, there were days I want to put up the president's Thursday tweet storm, because that was the one where you were just like, is this just more of the same from him, or is there something big? Literally, it was a rat-a-tat-tat, almost a tweet gun he issued. Rigged Russia witch hunt. Lester Holt got caught fudging my tape on Russia. Fake books. Enemy of the people. So much fake reporting and fake news. Collusion. And everybody's like, is he acting rattled? And there's always part of me, Amy, that says, yeah, something's new. Or
that it's just...
The walls are always closing in, or it's Trump.
Right.
What is it?
It's about keeping that energy up all the time of people who are on his team to say, never, ever take your eye off the ball, because the second that you do, they're going to come and get us, and you got to keep this energy as part of it. But I do think that this is what the remarkable piece of this entire campaign is. You had Senator Sullivan there saying, but remember, the economy's doing great, everybody's happy, we should be doing really well this election season. There was not one tweet in there about how great the economy was doing.
To John's beloved family, Mrs. McCain, to Cindy and the McCain children, President Mrs. Bush, President Secretary Clinton, Vice President Mrs. Biden, Vice President Mrs. Cheney, Vice President Gore, and as John would say, my friends. We come to celebrate an extraordinary man, a warrior, a statesman, a patriot, who embodied so much that is best in America. President Bush and I are among the fortunate few who competed against John at the highest levels of politics. He made us better presidents, just as he made the Senate better, just as he made this country better. So for someone like John to ask you, while he's still alive, to stand and speak of him when he's gone is a precious and singular honor. Now, when John called me with that request earlier this year, I'll admit sadness and also a certain surprise. But after our conversation ended, I realized how well it captured some of John's essential qualities. To start with, John liked being unpredictable, even a little contrarian. He had no interest in conforming to some prepackaged version of what a senator should be, and he didn't want a memorial that was going to be prepackaged either. It also showed John's disdain for self-pity. He had been to hell and back, and yet somehow never lost his energy or his optimism or his zest for life. So cancer did not scare him, and he would maintain that buoyant spirit to the very end, too stubborn to sit still, opinionated as ever, fiercely devoted to his friends, and most of all to his family. It showed his irreverence, his sense of humor, a little bit of a mischievous streak. After all, what better way to get a last laugh than to make George and I say nice things about him to a national audience? And most of all, it showed a largeness of spirit, an ability to see past differences in search of common ground. And in fact, on the surface, John and I could not have been more different. We're of different generations. I came from a broken home and never knew my father. John was the scion of one of America's most distinguished military families. I have a reputation for keeping cool. John, not so much. We were standard bearers of different American political traditions, and throughout my presidency, John never hesitated to tell me when he thought I was screwing up, which by his calculation was about once a day. But for all our differences, for all the times we sparred, I never tried to hide, and I think John came to understand the long-standing admiration that I had for him. By his own account, John was a rebellious young man. In his case, that's understandable. What faster way to distinguish yourself when you're the son and grandson of admirals than to mutiny? Eventually, though, he concluded that the only way to really make his mark on the world is to commit to something bigger than yourself. And for John, that meant answering the highest of callings, serving his country in a time of war. Others this week and this morning have spoken to the depths of his torment and the depths of his courage there in the cells of Hanoi, when day after day, year after year, that youthful iron was tempered into steel. And it brings to mind something that Hemingway wrote and the book that Megan referred to, his favorite book. Today is only one day in all the days that will ever be. But what will happen in all the other days that ever come can depend on what you do today. In captivity, John learned, in ways that few of us ever will, the meaning of those words. How each moment, each day, each choice is a test. And John McCain passed that test again and again and again. And that's why when John spoke of virtues like service and duty, it didn't ring hollow. They weren't just words to him. It was a truth that he had lived and for which he was prepared to die. And it forced even the most cynical to consider, what were we doing for our country? What might we risk everything for? You know, much has been said this week about what a maverick John was. Now, in fact, John was a pretty conservative guy. Trust me, I was on the receiving end of some of those votes. But he did understand that some principles transcend politics, that some values transcend party. He considered it part of his duty to uphold those principles and uphold those values. John cared about the institutions of self-government, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, rule of law, separation of powers, even the arcane rules and procedures of the Senate. He knew that in a nation as big and boisterous and diverse as ours, those institutions, those rules, those norms are what bind us together. They give shape and order to our common life. Even when we disagree, especially when we disagree. John believed in honest argument and hearing other views. He understood that if we get in the habit of bending the truth to suit political expediency or party orthodoxy, our democracy will not work. That's why he was willing to buck his own party at times, occasionally work across the aisle on campaign finance reform and immigration reform. That's why he championed a free and independent press as vital to our democratic debate. And the fact that it earned him some good coverage didn't hurt either. John understood, as JFK understood, as Ronald Reagan understood, that part of what makes our country great is that our membership is based not on our bloodline, not on what we look like, what our last names are. It's not based on where our parents or grandparents came from or how recently they arrived, but on adherence to a common creed, that all of us are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. It's been mentioned today, and we've seen footage this week of John pushing back against supporters who challenged my patriotism during the 2008 campaign. I was grateful, but I wasn't surprised. As Joe Lieberman said, it was John's instinct. I never saw John treat anyone differently because of their race or religion or gender. And I'm certain that in those moments that have been referred to during the campaign, he saw himself as defending America's character, not just mine. For he considered it the imperative of every citizen who loves this country to treat all people fairly. And finally, while John and I disagreed on all kinds of foreign policy issues, we stood together on America's role as the one indispensable nation, believing that with great power and great blessings comes great responsibility. That burden is borne most heavily by our men and women in uniform. Service members like Doug, and Jimmy, and Jack, who followed their father's footsteps, as well as the families who serve alongside our troops. But John understood that our security and our influence was won not just by our military might, not just by our wealth, not just by our ability to bend others to our will, but from our capacity to inspire others with our adherence to a set of universal values like rule of law and human rights, and an insistence on the God-given dignity of every human being. Of course, John was the first to tell us that he was not perfect. Like all of us who go into public service, he did have an ego. Like all of us, there were no doubt some votes he cast, some compromises he struck, some decisions he made that he wished he could have back. It's no secret, it's been mentioned, that he had a temper. And when it flared up, it was a force of nature, a wonder to behold. His jaw grinding, his face reddening, his eyes boring a hole right through you. Not that I ever experienced it firsthand, mind you. But to know John was to know that as quick as his passions might flare, he was just as quick to forgive and ask for forgiveness. He knew more than most his own flaws and his blind spots. And he knew how to laugh at himself. And that self-awareness made him all the more compelling. We didn't advertise it, but every so often over the course of my presidency, John would come over to the White House, and we'd just sit and talk in the Oval Office, just the two of us. We'd talk about policy, and we'd talk about family, and we'd talk about the state of our politics. And our disagreements didn't go away during these private conversations. Those were real, and they were often deep. But we enjoyed the time we shared away from the bright lights. And we laughed with each other. And we learned from each other. And we never doubted the other man's sincerity or the other man's patriotism, or that when all was said and done, we were on the same team. We never doubted we were on the same team. For all of our differences, we shared a fidelity to the ideals for which generations of Americans have marched and fought and sacrificed and given their lives. We considered our political battles a privilege, an opportunity to serve as stewards of those ideals here at home and to do our best to advance them around the world. We saw this country as a place where anything is possible. And citizenship is an obligation to ensure it forever remains that way. And more than once during his career, John drew comparisons to Teddy Roosevelt. And I'm sure it's been noted that Roosevelt's man in the arena oration seems tailored to John. Most of you know it. Roosevelt speaks of those who strive, who dare to do great things, who sometimes win and sometimes come up short, but always relish a good fight. A contrast to those cold, timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Isn't that the spirit we celebrate this week? That striving to be better, to do better, to be worthy of the great inheritance that our founders bestowed. So much of our politics, our public life, our public discourse can seem small and mean and petty. Trafficking in bombast and insult and phony controversies and manufactured outrage. It's a politics that pretends to be brave and tough, but in fact is born of fear. John called on us to be bigger than that. He called on us to be better than that. Today is only one day in all the days that will ever be. But what will happen in all the other days that will ever come can depend on what you do today. What better way to honor John McCain's life of service than, as best we can, follow his example? To prove that the willingness to get in the arena and fight for this country is not reserved for the few, it is open to all of us. That in fact it's demanded of all of us as citizens of this great republic. That's perhaps how we honor him best. By recognizing that there are some things bigger than party or ambition or money or fame or power. That there's some things that are worth risking everything for. Principles that are eternal. Truths that are abiding. At his best, John showed us what that means. For that, we are all deeply in his debt. May God bless John McCain. May God bless this country he served so well.